Hey guys, give me 1 second. Alrighty. Not a lot of people today. Everyone's in New Year mode. Hello, hello. Please drop an OS basics video in 1 to 100. Operating systems? Oh, open source. Okay. Sure. Soon. Probably this week. Happy, well, belated New Year, guys. Alright. Perfect. Works for me. अभी तो नहीं करते हैं. एडवांस में नहीं करते हैं. विश आने के बाद करते हैं. Alright, 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 alright. AI course. People are asking AI course. Yes, I will announce it tomorrow on 31st. But yes, something is happening, and tomorrow you guys would know. It's not the most latest React. Well, it is pretty latest, but it's not. It does not have generative AI, but has a bunch of other things. So tomorrow you guys will know. I will announce it. All right, all right, all right. मैं नहीं ला रहा हूँ. I'm adding it for free in this specific course. So in 0 to 1, 1 to 100, 0 to 100, adding any AI course. बात हो गई है बंदे से. All right. वेब 3. वेब 3 के लिए तो यार कोई है ही अच्छा कोर्स. एक ही है वैसे. वो तो बहुत, वो बंदा बाहर का है, वो तो नहीं करेगा. We'll see. थोड़ा पॉज मारते हैं. आई थिंक there's a lot to cover already. Today's class is React heavy. Let me pause chat here. I'm good. Yeah, people in 1 to 100 who are asking for open source contribution videos. Processing की इस week आ जाएगी. So I'm going to set up P5JS editor, P5JS, and एक और library उनकी, repository उनकी, I forgot. So 3 repositories of the same organization I'll try to set up this week and post it for everyone, even for 1 to 100 people. Cool. ठीक है, let me check my mic here. Let me check my storage here. Yes. Audio. Mic testing. Alrighty. ठीक है guys, 7:03. I think good time to begin today's class for the people who don't have the slides already. Let me post it in chat one more time. You can find it on Discord as well. But the slides can be found here. Now, I know a few of you cannot copy this. So let me quickly create a short URL as well. There you go. So this is a shorter URL. Feel free to copy it. I'm going to paste it in the slides as well. ठीक है जी, the slides are present here. Might be a good idea to open these locally because we have a few, what do you call it? A few gists that I've posted in the slides. So might be a good idea for you guys to have it. With that, let's start today's video. Today's video is I wouldn't call it a deep dive into React. I would call it a shallow dive, or more like a, hold on. Haha. Of course, I'm not sharing my screen, am I? Yes, there we go. Desktop one. There we go. There we go. Much better. Sorry about that. As I was saying, today's class is a deeper dive, a shallow dive into React. Basically, want to understand why React was introduced, basic syntax, this thing called JSX, more specifically, a bunch of these jargons we'll try to understand. The goal is that today is the last foundational class for React, and after this, we can get into a lot of implementation. I've said this before, there are 3-4 major humps in the journey of full stack development. React is the second biggest one. So last week's class 4.2 and today's class are meant to be slow so that we can, take as many people as we can over the hump and teach you some, call it jargon, call it why React was introduced, call it introduction to the React syntax. But by the end, the hope is that you are able to write a basic React component. You're understanding what are components, what is state, the difference between them, static versus dynamic websites, what is state, what is components, what is re-rendering, JSX, and this thing called class versus class names. That's a high level of what we'll try to cover today. Few extra things, few less things, but high level. These are the new things that you might learn from today's class. Cool. Let's begin with, why do you need React? I have a message on WhatsApp here. Let's see if everything is on the up and up. Might be missing something. No, of course it is someone distracting me. So let me close WhatsApp here. All right. Why do you need React or Vue.js or any front-end frameworks? Well, yeah, 10 different frameworks that came into the picture. And the answer is, for most static websites, though you don't at all. Not at all. You don't need them for static websites. You don't need them for dynamic websites also. Believe it or not, any website that you look at can actually be written in raw HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. But specifically static websites. And what do I mean when I say static? By static, I mean a website that does not change its content once the website is loaded. For example, here, as you can see, this is my blog that I've written. This is the HTML for it. H1 tag, H3 tag, simple stuff. And this is the thing that renders at the end. You will notice nothing new is getting added once the page is loaded. Nothing is getting removed. It's pretty much static. That's what a static website means. A website whose HTML isn't changing as time goes by is a static website. For these websites, you don't need React. Should you use React? Sure, it will make your life slightly easier. But this isn't the biggest use case that React solves for. React solves for dynamic websites. For dynamic websites, these libraries make it easier to do DOM manipulation. What is DOM manipulation, Harkirat? The thing we discussed last week. For an example like this, where you have, let's say, a button and a person clicks on the button, the counter goes up. Now this is no longer a static website. The contents of this page are changing as you are pressing a button, which means this is significantly different from a website like this. A website like this loads once, nothing changes in the HTML of this page. A website like this loads once, and then as you press a button, the HTML of this page keeps on changing. This is a dynamic website. This is sort of hard to write. If you look at the code on the left, what have I done? In the HTML part, I've defined a button. And in the JavaScript part, I've defined a function called onButtonPress, which does what? It gets this DOM element internal value, this DOM element's internal value, which means counter 4 in this variable. It sort of splits it and gets the first element here, which will be basically 4. What do you want to do when someone clicks on it? You want to change counter 4 to counter 5. And then when someone clicks on it again, you want to change counter 5 to counter 6. Keep increasing this counter one by one. This is the code to do it. If you look through it, you should understand it based on all the things you have done until now. High level, get the value counter 4, this string in a variable, document.getElementById button, which is this button.innerHTML. Once you have it, split it using this space. What does the split function do? It converts a string like this into an array where the first element is counter, second element is 4. It splits a string given a delimiter. Delimiter basically represents the thing that you want to separate the elements in. In this case, we want to separate counter from 4, and space is the thing that separates them. This is the syntax to do it. We'll see this very soon when we write this code. And then we get the new counter, current counter plus 1. And then finally, we update the value inside this button. And this is how you have a simple dynamic website. We will be writing this code very soon. So if you don't understand this completely, it's fine. But as you can see, a lot of code you have to write, a lot of, mathematical things you have to do, get the specific thing, do a +1, and then, reset that thing here. Very verbose. So something like this, easier to write. Something like this, mildly hard to write. But as you get to a use case like LinkedIn or Facebook, where, everything on the page is changing so fast, this is very hard to write. You cannot keep writing this code again and again. So React came into the picture. What is React? React is just an easier way to write normal HTML, CSS, and JavaScript syntax. It's a new syntax that under the hood converts everything to HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So does your browser understand React? No. React is just one syntax to convert that finally gets converted into HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Your browser still understands this only. Your browser still receives, for example, a JavaScript file like this, an HTML file, a CSS file. But you as the developer write code in React. To understand this analogy better, you can take an example of ChatGPT. Okay, what do you use ChatGPT for today? You go to ChatGPT, you tell it, give me some React code for this website, and it spits out the React code, right? Similarly, given this React code, it can spit out HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. This is just an easier way to write this, and ChatGPT is just an easier way to write React. Cool. Your browser does not understand React. Your browser only understands these three things. React eventually gets converted into these three things. You usually don't worry about them. You only worry about the React syntax. And then finally, the React compiler, transpiler takes care of converting this into this. Why React? Why do you want to write syntax like this when you can already write syntax like this? It's a little hard to write. I get it. But is React really good? Does it like take away a lot of pain of writing dynamic websites? And the answer is yes. People realized it's hard to write DOM or to do DOM manipulation in the conventional way. What do I mean the conventional way? The way we have done it until now. There were libraries that came into the picture that made it slightly easy to do DOM manipulation, but still for a very big app, it's really hard. jQuery is one such library. jQuery came into the picture to make it easy to do DOM manipulation. And if you have to write code like this using jQuery, you can, and you will see your life is slightly easier. You can do DOM manipulation slightly easily if you use jQuery. jQuery is also a GSOC organization. Used to be very popular in 2013, 14, 15. When I was in college, basically, one of my seniors, in fact, one of my closest mentors was one of the students in jQuery for 1 year, and then one was a mentor for another year. Back then was a big thing. But slowly, the new way to do DOM manipulation, which is React, Vue.js, picked up speed, and then that's the standard way to do it. Now no one uses jQuery anymore. Eventually, Vue React created a new syntax for writing frontends, and under the hood, the React compiler converts your code into HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. This is why React was introduced. Where was it introduced? React was conceived inside Facebook. Facebook was creating a very big website, and they realized that, haan bhai, cannot do coding like this. This is very hard for a very big application. Let's create a new syntax that we will sort of create as a library and then open source. Let's look at a simple example. This example right here, the on button press example. There is a gist at the end of the slides. I would urge you to copy it, open it in Replit, open it in your local machine, either works, and try this code out locally. Make sure you understand the code. If you want to put some logs here, feel free to. I'm going to do the same thing here on my screen. If you don't want to do it locally, that's mostly fine as well. This is fairly simple. But if you would generally urge you to do all of this locally. This is the code base. Let me copy it over. For those of you who joined in late, you can find the slides on this URL. I'm going to keep the screen here for 10 seconds. Feel free to take a screenshot. All right. So I'm going to do it on Replit. You can do it locally as well. Just create an empty HTML file, and that should just do it. Run. And I have a button here. If I click on the button, the value goes up. If you look at the logs, in case you feel like exploring, I've put a log here. This split function might be new to a few of you, but what it does at a high level is, given a string like this, Akirat space sing space Kamboj, that's my full name for those of you who don't know. X.split space will create an array, Harkirat, sing, Kamboj. These are the three values inside the array. So if I'm given a string, counter 1, and if I want to extract 1 from it, what can I do? Y.split space. This will give me the array. And y.split space of 1, which is the second element here. This is the 0th element. This is the second element. Will give me 1. This way I can get 1. And then what do? Once I get this one in this current counter variable, I do a parse int of current count plus one. Harkirat, why do you do a parse int of current count? Because what is 1 plus 1? It is 11. So you have to parse this into an integer. You can also parse this into a float if you want. But either way, never add a string to a number. It will just append it to the end. You have to first parse it. Cool. All right. This seems to work. This is highly verbose. Wish there was an easier way to write this. Marinate this for 15 seconds and then we will proceed. Try this out locally in an index.html file or on Replit, and then we will proceed further. These are the slides for someone who hasn't yet gotten the slides. And in the slides, you will find the code for this right here on slide 8. All right, guys. Simple example, works, great way to write front end, but getting more and more verbose. Let's understand how React makes this better. Let's start with some jargon. To create a React app, you usually need to worry about two things. Pay attention here. These two things are important. In fact, there are three. There is components, there is state, and there is re-rendering. If you understand these three things well, is when React becomes easier. If you miss any of these things, it will be hard. So components, state, and re-rendering. Let's understand these. State and components are two big things you need to write whenever you're writing React code. What do you have to write whenever you're writing standard HTML, CSS, JavaScript code? You write, some HTML part. You write some JavaScript part that does DOM manipulation. Whenever you're writing React code, you have to write state and components. If you write these two things, everything else React takes care of. Creators of front-end frameworks realized that all websites can effectively be divided into two parts: state, components. What is state? An object that represents the current state of the application. What do I mean when I say object? A JavaScript object. It represents the dynamic things in your app, things that change. For example, the value of the counter. I could create an extremely complex application, but if the only thing that is changing is that button, the counter button, that is what I need to hold in the state. Everything else does not need to be part of the state. Anything on your website that changes is called the state. Anything that does not change, you don't have to worry about. Let's look at some example. For an app like this, you can say your state looks like this. Excuse me. Okay, bhai, count 1, count 2, count 3, count 4. Whatever is the current count here, I can represent this single object can represent ki, haan, bhai, this is what my website should look like. Of course, there are static parts. This counter always remains static. The button always remains there. This website could have 10 different things. But the thing that is changing, I can put inside a variable called count. This effectively, I can say, is the state of my dynamic counter application. This is a fairly simple example. So let's look at a slightly more complex real world example. LinkedIn. LinkedIn is a very big website. Let's not worry about the whole website. Let's say you had to build just the top bar for LinkedIn. If you look at the top bar, what are the dynamic things here? What are the things that are changing? The image, the notification count here, the notification count here. Even the image here is actually should be part of state variable, but ignore that for now. For the same person, let's say Harkirat is the only LinkedIn user and Harkirat will always have this image here. For this same user, what are the things that are dynamic here? What, keeps on changing as time goes by? If I open my LinkedIn page, suddenly this 10 becomes 20, then 30. If I keep it open for an hour, more notifications come dynamically. Somehow this number goes up. This changes, which means if I had to statify this top bar, if I had to convert it into a state variable, I would say my state of this app is like this. It has a top bar, which has home notifications 0, my network notifications 99 plus, job notifications 0, messages 0, notifications 10. I can say कि हाँ, this represents this, and would be nice if I just, change this to 10 and then my UI automatically updates to 10. We'll see how that happens. But React ka mota mota, the thing is this only. You maintain a state which represents your dynamic bits, and then you just have to update the state. React takes care of actually updating the DOM elements. Cool. This is how state would look like for a LinkedIn top bar. That was the first thing I said we have to discuss. What is the second thing? Components. How a DOM element should render given a state. It is a reusable dynamic HTML snippet that changes given the state. It's not actually an HTML snippet, but okay, for now, let's assume. How a DOM element should render given a state. Matlab, this is effectively a component. Ki haan bhai, given a state, given 99 plus, I know I have to render like this. If this input state was 0, I know I have to render like this without any red thing on top. This part is called a component. Of course, that means this top bar has bunch of components, and that is true for any application. You see any big application out there, it has thousands of components. So does the LinkedIn top bar. How a DOM element should render given a state? It is a reusable dynamic HTML snippet that changes given a state. The button component is effectively, the button, this thing that you see here is effectively a component. It takes a state, the current count as an input, and is supposed to render accordingly. If the input to this button is 5, it needs to render as counter 5. If the input to this button is 4, it needs to render like this. This again is a simpler example. This is a better example. When you write a React application for the LinkedIn top bar, you would have a state that looks something like this, and you would have a bunch of components defined. Hakikat, what are components? What does the code look like? We will get to it. But high level, what did I say? It is an HTML snippet, you could say. If the input is X, I need to render a div inside which I have an icon, above which I have a notification bell, which the value of which is whatever is the input in this state. If you give to React these two things, this is the component, this is the state. Once, you just have to give it to React once. Then as you update your state, React takes care of actually updating the DOM elements. That's a high level of how React works, not exactly how it works under the hood, how it expects developers to write code. How does it expect developers to write code? Give me a state of your application, which means a very big object that represents all the dynamic parts of your application. Give me all your individual components and how they are structured together. Give me how this state is connected to these components. For example, React may we have to tell ke bhai, this notification number is what needs to appear here. And this my network number is what needs to appear here. The thing that React takes care of is that once you have given all of this, just update this. I will update all of these under the hood. Cool. High level. That is what state and component means. We'll get to this more practically as more slides come by. Lastly, re-rendering is another jargon you need to know. Given this state, the component looks like this. Let's say I update the state. I change this to 12. Then this needs to change to 12 as well. This thing of me updating the state, when would this state update? Whenever, the backend tells the website, okay, the number of notifications have gone up. A new connection request came in, whatever the reason might be. There is some backend request that might go out every 20 seconds to check the current notification count. It gets ke bhai, notifications have been increased by 2. The developer changes this to 12 and React re-renders. What is re-rendering? It takes this current input and puts it here. It changes the DOM element. That is what is called re-rendering. A state change triggers a re-render. A re-render represents the actual DOM being manipulated when the state changes. If this state changes and the actual DOM element also updates, is what we call a re-render. For example, if this changes from 10 to 11, this notification count will go up by 1. This is called a re-render. So what have we learned? We've learned 3 things in React: state, components, re-rendering. There are a few extra things that React does under the hood. There's one thing called the virtual DOM that you might have heard of. We discussed this a little bit last week. The virtual DOM is sort of a representation of the current DOM that React keeps in memory. uses it to calculate the difference between this state and the old state, and then understands what updates it needs to make. We don't have to worry about that yet. For this class, worry about three things: state, components, re-rendering. Cool. All right. I think we're pretty close to getting into implementation here. So I'll do a poll very soon, but you usually have to define all the components once, and then all you have to do is update the state of your application. React takes care of re-rendering your app. That is how you would write React code. Okay, let's do a pause here. A lot of theory. Slowly we will get into actually implementing state, components, re-rendering for a bunch of applications. Let's do a quick poll, understand if we're good to go, and then we will proceed. 91% is great. Again, happy to take doubts at the end, but 91% theory we understand. Great. Abhi 91 hai, it will go down. I'm sort of certain, but hopefully not by too much. Okay. Let's create the state, this specific counter app that we created using states and components. But now I am going a little off topic. I am asking you guys to write similar code like we have until now, but using the concepts of states and components. I am saying that you don't have to yet use React. Don't worry about React. Write the same application, still use DOM manipulation, but write it a different way. Create a global state variable, which will represent the state of your application, which currently for this application, we only have to worry about the count. That's the dynamic thing. And then define, this is not the right one, is it? This is the right code. Define a function called button component. If you're on this slide, feel free to ignore this. This is not the best code. This is the better code. This is what I'm asking you to write. Okay, don't worry about React yet. Still have to create the counter app, but write it a different way. Have a state variable on top, which basically means an object on top. Let state equal to count. Define a function called button component, which takes the count as an input. And what does it do? Gets the button element, creates the button element, puts the inner HTML, attaches an on-click handler, and returns the button. What does this function have to do? Create a button div element given an input. That's why I've called it button component. What did I say components were? I said this are all components. Given a state, how should this render is what should be written inside your component logic. That is exactly what I've done in this function right here. What is the function button component? Given a count input, creates a button element, puts the inner HTML, which is counter space 1, counter space 2, whatever the input might be, sets the attribute on click to be on button press, which is this function right here, and then returns the button. Just a different way to write our original application. This part is state initialization. Initializing a global state कि हाँ भाई initially count is 0. These two parts are defining the button component. कि भाई the button component looks like this. Button on click needs to call this specific function, and given a count variable, this is how the final div would look like. What would this function do? This function would basically create a simple button div. Oh, wow, that's big. तो छोटा कैसे करें? Oh, there you go. All right. What did I say a component was? It takes some state as an input and it spits out a div, a button, something, some HTML given this state. If the input state count here is 1, this is what it needs to spit out. If the input here is 2, It needs to spit out this, so on and so forth. So what is this component, or specifically the button component that I've written does? Takes in a state variable, spits out an HTML DOM button, the contents of which depend on the input state. That is one thing I've written. And what is the other thing I wrote? Maybe bhul gaya. Let's see. The global state. What did I say React app has? State, components. And third thing I said was re-renders. State for a counter or app, initially at least, is as simple as this. Count 0. Components, since this is a simple application, doesn't have too many dynamic parts. LinkedIn top bar, there are too many components. Here, there is just one component. I've called it button component. Takes the current count as an input, returns a div inside which this part represents whatever the input was. And it also has an on-click handler here. Do we understand this code? If you understand this, life is going to be super easy from here. But if you're stuck here, of course, we don't understand how the whole code works, but do we understand this function, what it's supposed to do, and a global state variable that I've defined? Hoping this is simple only. 82%. कोई चक्कर नहीं. Let's look at the whole app together. Let's see it function, and then we will do another poll. See if we still face issues. All right. All right. Let's write this code here. Open Replit, and most probably this gist here is right. It could be wrong because I wrote the code a different way initially and then eventually changed it. Let's see. If not, we will write it together. Don't worry. This code is right. So please go to this gist from the slides and copy it over, open it in either Replit or open it in your local machine. Either works. Right, going to wait for 10 seconds here. All right. Take a breather. Don't worry. It's just 30 lines of code, and we'll go through this again and again until we understand this, because this part is important. If we understand this, we will understand the React version of this app pretty easily. Try to run this and see if it does what it's supposed to do. Seems like it is. Which means I have written the same code that I wrote a few slides ago. That one was much lesser. That was like maybe 7 lines of code. Let me show you that code as well. This code also creates the same application. This code also creates the same application, and this looks much more uglier. It's like, Harkirat, what is this? This is, am I sharing the wrong screen here? Hello? 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 I am I not? तुम लोग drift protocol पढ़ रहे हो कब से? Sorry guys. That's a decentralized finance protocol I was going through yesterday. Understanding how a decentralized exchange is made. My bad. We will restart. What was I saying? I was saying, okay, if you open this specific code, this is the long way of writing this counter. This is the shorter way, much easier way of writing the same application. But why have I written it like this? Because React works like this under the hood. Believe it or not, if you actually open the final HTML CSS file of React, it will be very big. But as the developer, what you have to write will be very small. For example, here, if you look at it, what does on button press need to do? It needs to do 2 things. State.count ++ button component re-render. That is it. Once the application is written, the developer has to only worry about this part, right? This is much more better than, look at this on button press. Such a big code you have to write. Here, only 2 lines of code you have to write. Update the state and then call component re-render. This is, if you look at it, if as the developer I told you, कि भाई you only have to write this function, then of course this function is much better than this function. But Harkirat, you too had to write so much code. Yes. But once we reach React, you will see this is actually just the React library. This is actually just the React library. This you have to write in React, which it's not too difficult to write this in React. It's much easier. And this you have to write. When we actually get to React, you won't have to write this and this. We don't have the React library here, which is why I had to write this logic. But effectively, when we reach React, you will see you have to define three things. The initial state, how my app looks like this initially. Your component, this is what my button component looks like given a count input. This is the button that it needs to return. What will this return? It will return something like this. Button on click equal to on button render. Whatever state, sorry, counter 2 and then slash button. It'll just return an HTML element like this, a DOM element like this. And on button press simply updates the global state. Don't even worry about this. Also React will take care of. So isn't this a slightly cleaner way of writing this versus this? Debatable. You might say, Harkirat, this felt easier to me. This feels, so many things are happening. I don't understand what is happening. I get it. But as your application grows, this will be much harder to write. And this is much easier to write. When we reach React, you will see this is sort of the only thing you have to worry about as your app becomes more dynamic. As you can see, we are only updating the state here. It's literally one line of code that is updating the global state variable. And everything else, putting it over here, has been taken care of by who? By all this commented code, which is going to be React eventually. Okay? That is why this syntax of writing this app, where we have number one, a component that we had to write, number two, a global state and a state update that triggers a re-render. Writing that is slightly easier. You will see as we get into more complex apps than writing the code this way, even though totally you could argue that Harkirat, this looks easier to me right now. But as your app goes, this is slightly better. Now let's understand how this code works. I said, okay, in React, you have to just define your components and your state. React takes care of updating your DOM. Let's see how that is happening. What happens in this application? This gets defined. This function gets defined. This function gets defined. This function gets defined. And I call button component re-render. I explicitly call it because if I don't call this, then what will get rendered here? We have an empty div on top, right? We have nothing else. Of course, nothing will get called. So even in React, or even when you're trying to emulate React, which is what we're doing here, you have to at least once do the render. The first render. What do I mean when I say render? Okay, bhai, take the state and put out whatever the component wants to put out here on the DOM. That is why I had to manually trigger the first component re-render, and that is what you see here. And once this renders, what does this button component re-render function do? Takes the button parent, which is this div right here, empties it out. That's what the first line does. Removes this button from here. Then calls button component. This is where the React library is using the logic that you've written, using the component that you've defined, giving it a state and getting back the button component, the thing that I had written here. Count 1 slash button. The React library, the emulated React library, is getting back your component given this state, which is basically getting back this div, and then putting it here. This part of, taking the state, giving it to the component, getting it back, and removing things from the DOM, putting them back on the DOM, is taken care of by eventually React. Right now, the library that we have written, or the function that we have written. But this is how the function is working under the hood. Anytime I click on this button, what happens? The on click gets called. What does on click called? On button press. What does on button press do? Increases the state variables count value and then calls button component re-render, which will again do the same thing. It will remove this button from the div, get back the new component from you, and then append it back. So that is how we have emulated a React app. We have created a dynamic application the React way, where we've defined a component, we've defined a state, and our on-click handler just updates the state and calls button component re-render. This function takes care of re-rendering the DOM, re-putting a button here. Cool. Take 15 seconds, try to run it locally, put some logs here, maybe put a log here. What is component? And then let's run it. Let's run this a few times. Let's open the console. As you can see, button is this DOM element that's created in memory, counter 7, counter 6, counter 5. Anytime I click on it, this gets rendered. And what happens if I, don't do this? Then, of course, nothing will get rendered here. This will just clear the DOM. What happens if I don't clear the DOM and only do this? Then more and more buttons will keep on getting appended. That is why, you have to do both the things. First, clear the DOM, then put the new element in the DOM given the state. And that is how we created dynamic application emulating React. How are we doing? Let's do a poll. If we are 85% understands, then we'll probably be sorted. If not, then happy to continue. Happy to, rediscuss. But again, doubt session at the end. No, not great. 75. So 740 हो ही गए. ठीक है. Because this part is important. So if 75 understands this, this is a mess break time for everyone until 7:55, which means a 13-minute break. 1-3. Let me open the chat and answer some questions. Please ask actionable questions related to the current slide or like the current things that have been discussed. The code flow. So bilkul code flow. What happens when I click on run? Number one, control reaches here. The div gets rendered empty div. Let's remove everything. What happens when I do this? An empty div gets put here. ठीक है, sir. Let me add back the script. Let me remove everything. What happens if I have just this div and the script? An empty variable gets defined, nothing else. Let's uncomment a bunch of function definitions. What happens if I run this? Same empty thing here. Let's uncomment the last function call. Now what will happen? Control will reach here. Function define, function define, function define, function call. Function call will make sure the control reaches here. And then the first thing gets put here, which is counter 0. The button component re-render emptied the original div, which it is empty only, so no difference as such happens, gets this button DOM variable here and puts it in the button parent right here. And hence you see a counter 0 button here. The first time, nothing I'm doing. I'm not clicking on this button. Just running this puts an empty function here or an empty button here. Now, as I click on this, what is happening? Let me inspect here. What is button on click referring to? On button press. So let's see the on button press function. What is it doing? State.count plus plus, or what does that mean? State.count equal to state.count plus 1. And then again calling button component re-render. As you can see, initially also I called button component re-render. Anytime I'm pressing the button, I'm again calling button component re-render. Why am I calling this function? Because the state has changed. The state is what your application should look like. What did I say in the slides? Okay, for our counter application, state looks something like this. Count 1 right now. And if the state looks like this, the DOM should have counter 1 here. If the state looks like count 2, DOM should have count 2. Similarly, what am I doing here? On button press, change the value in this global state variable and then call button component re-render. Why have I named this function button component re-render? Because if you look at the flow that I said, you have state, you have components, and then a state change triggers a re-render. What am I doing here? Changing the state, right? Since we don't yet have React, we have to manually write the code that bhai state has changed. Let's re-render. State has changed. Let's re-render. Effectively, this function takes the global state and updates your application. That is what I'm doing here. कि भाई state variable has changed. Let me call this function. If I don't have this function, remove it. Remove this function call. If I say global state is 10, and if I run this, you see counter 10 here. If I say global state is 200 and run here, I see counter 200 here, which means this function takes the state as an input and spits out this component as an output. That is how React also does things. And that is what we're trying to get to eventually. Make React to do. I think we'll get there eventually. What is component? As I said, right now in our application, this is a component. It is a reusable chunk. Basically, I have written this. I can use this in multiple places. I can create another button here using this button component, right? It takes a state as an input, spits out a div as an output. If I put this function in my console, I can create various variations of button. I can ask button component 10 and returns me a button that says counter 10. 11 returns me a button counter 11, so on and so forth. So it's a reusable function that, given a state input, returns a button with the contents of the button changed. Please explain component. So a lot of people are asking component. Component basically is any if you look at Replit right now, if the Replit code is written in React, which most probably it is, this would be a component there. What would this take as an input? It would take as an input कि हाँ भाई, what should be written here? Run, or should compile be written here, or something else? It will be a function. And whenever you call that function in the Replit source code with run, it will return you a button that says play run. When you call the same function with compile, it would return you run with compile written here. This icon with compile written here, so on and so forth. The other things that this component could take as input might be the icon, which right now is the play icon, could be something else. Another thing it could take as an input would be the color. Right now it is green, could be something else. So a function that takes props as an input or a state as an input and returns you back the actual HTML of something on your website is called a component. Fiber might be a little out of scope at the moment. Happy to discuss in an extra class. If I write div below the script, it doesn't show up. Why? Yeah. So if you write div below the script, how will your control start? You run your app, control reaches here, here, here. Button component re-render reaches here. Does a document.getElement by ID button parent. Button parent isn't yet defined. It is defined after the script, which is why you will see an error that will say cannot share property of null inner HTML, which basically means this resolves to null because this code hasn't yet reached. Any HTML file starts from the top. So first this will run, this will run, this will run, this will run, this will call this will run, and the HTML isn't defined, which is why you have to define it up front so that the div renders first and then your app runs. Summary, re-rendering. Can you please explain these once real quick? If I write div, okay, answer that. In our function, are we deleting and creating rather than we are not recalculating the diff to keep things simple. When you use React in the real world, it will not remove and then re-add. It will calculate the diff. It will understand that there was a button here. It will just update the contents of the button. Let's not go there yet. For now, just to emulate things, we are removing everything and then re-adding it. Why even after shutting down the servers of React, counter keeps working? Why even after shutting down the servers of React, counter keeps working on the HTML page? React is just a way to write HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. You write React code once, you generate HTML, CSS, and JavaScript once. Iske baad React dies, the library dies, your computer dies, does not matter. You have HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. This JavaScript under the hood uses the React library, has the React library, which is why You don't need React anymore, which is why it even works if even if you delete the React source code, as long as you have the HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. If you are using ChatGPT to write some code, even if OpenAI dies, as long as you have this code, you are fine, right? It gave you the final thing you needed from it. Similarly, once you use React to write some HTML, CSS, and basically once you compile your React code into HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, does not matter what happens here. You have the final code. Share PPT again. This is the URL to get the PPT. Why are you creating the button element again and again? Just to show. You don't have to create it again and again. You can totally optimize this code base to be like, bhaiya, get the current button element and just update it. You could. That is how React would do it eventually as well. But just to show right now, keep things simple. I've done it this way. You shouldn't ideally remove the button and then re-add it. That's a good point. But we're doing it just to keep things simple for now. Summary: append child. We discussed this before. Append child. This thing right here puts a component in the DOM. If I can create as many components as I want in memory. I can be like document.create element div. Let x equal to this. X I have as a variable. I don't have it yet in the DOM. If I want to put it here, I have to first get an element that I want to put it inside. For example, button parent, and then once I have this button parent, I can do dot append child and put the X div inside. And then now this div actually reached here. It's an empty div, which is why you don't see anything there. But append child actually appends something to the DOM. All right. In our function, we aren't deleting, and we are not deleting it to keep things simple. You should ideally, update. I get it. Yes. Why to create button over and over? Only value change should work, right? Yeah, only value change should work. Just to show how button component gets created again and again. Have I done this? Totally agree. You don't have to recreate the button component again and again. In our function, we aren't deleting, and then okay, cool. Answered that a few times. So yeah, I get yes. Ideally, what should happen? Ideally, यहाँ पे this should check, if okay, what happens if let's say the state was this, कि हाँ भाई counters, there are many counters right now. There's just one counter, and you see one button. If the state becomes this, you should see two buttons. If the state becomes this, you should see three buttons. If our state was like this, then you would have a for loop here, and then you would have to add more elements. In that case, should we go there or not? Let's go there really quickly. In this use case, yes, you don't have to delete the DOM element and then re-add it. But if the use case was, okay, this is an array, and if there are two elements here, you should see two buttons. If there are three elements here, you should see three buttons, so on and so forth. In this case, though, we will have to append them, right? That is why where you would actually recreate them. And of course, if the state goes down, if the original state was this, you would have three buttons. And then, the state gets converted to this, you would only have one button. In this case, you would also delete DOM elements. And let's say the original state was this, and then the new state is this. Then you would just update the existing element. Yes, that is how you would do it. Just to keep things simple here and, not write a lot of diff logic have I written it this way. But yes, sure. You don't actually have to recreate the button again and again. Cool. Let's do a quick recap. What have we discussed until now? Let me revert the code back to a state where it was. All right. Quick recap of all that we've discussed until this point. In the real world, you have dynamic websites. Any website that you look at, be it LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, they're all dynamic. What do I mean when I say dynamic? Okay, when you go to these websites, initially you see some HTML. Then eventually, as you explore the website, HTML changes. Things get appended, things get removed, so on and so forth. There are a few ways you can create these dynamic websites. One of the ways, you on one side define your global state, which what would it be in case of Instagram? It would be something like this. Name Harkirat, feed array. First post might be, whatever photo URL, whatever is the photo URL of the first post, owner name of the specific post owner photo, like count, so on and so forth. This would be the state of an Instagram app. And if you had written Instagram in React, which, well, Instagram is written in React, then all you would have to do as the person scrolls is update this state variable, add more elements to this feed, and React would take care of actually appending more and more posts here. How would React do that? React will be able to do that if you tell React, bhai, given this state, the feed, each of the element in this feed needs to be rendered like this. Here is a component that takes this feed as an input and spits out the HTML for a post, which is, what does a post look like? There is the name of the person, there is the image, there are comments, there is the like count. Here is a function that takes one such feed as an input, one such post as an input, spits out this HTML. If you write this logic in React somehow, where you define components and define a global state and connect them somehow, tell React, ke bhai, this is the global state, these are the components, then React would know how to render the Instagram application, and you don't have to write it the way we have been writing it right now. Cool? Maybe not cool. Let's take a quick poll here and see how we're doing. Let's proceed a bit, and then happy to finish early and take doubts at the end. Let's do a poll. Cool. So for the people who still think this is fast, two things I would suggest. One, you don't actually have to know this. As long as you understand the final React code, you'll be fine. This is just a way for us to finally reach there. So if you don't understand this code, it's fine. If you understand this original code and how it is creating the same application, you should be fine. And of course, I will take doubts at the end. You don't have to understand this one. This is just an extra side track that we took. Let's get to React and understand the syntax of React and see if we can create the same thing there. If we understand that, we're mostly fine. We don't have to understand this. Cool. ठीक है जी. Let's go back to the slides. The equivalent of this big code in React looks something like this. Number one, notice there aren't as many lines of code. You have to write a lot of code here. You don't have to write a lot of code here. Why? Because a lot of this re-render logic is present in the React library, so you don't have to worry about it. How have I written this code? React has a bunch of files, 20 different files, but this is your main file. You can think of this as the meat of your logic. And let's see how I've written that logic for a simple button application. At the top, I've said const count, set count equal to react.useState0. This part is just the way for you to define state in React. You might ask, Akirat, why so complicated? Why can't I write state like this? Great question. Unless you define your state like this, React won't watch those state variables. What do I mean when I say watch? I mean, okay, what is the architecture we have discussed until now? Okay, there is a state, there are components. Anytime the state changes, components re-render. React, whoever has written that library said, okay, unless you define your state variables like this, if you define them like this, I am not going to watch them. So if this updates, I will not re-render your app will look the same. So you can try to write, count like this here. But as you change count, your app won't re-render, your counter will not go up. So you have to define state like this. Now you might ask, Akirat, ye syntax kya hai? What is this syntax? First time I'm seeing this. This is what's called array destructuring probably. It's basically if you have an object, an array that looks like this, const arr equal to 1 comma 2. I can do arr of 0 to get the first element, arr of 1 to get the second element, or I can do const a comma b equal to arr. And what will this do? In A, I get the first value, B, I get the second value. Basically, I can do const a comma b equal to 1 comma 2. That would take the first value, put it here in the A variable, take the second value, put it here in the B variable. This is probably called array destructuring, might be called something else. I'm just assuming this because you can do the same thing for objects, and that is called object destructuring. For example, I can totally do something like, const name equal to name Harkirat, age 21. This is called array object destructuring. Given an object, getting back a specific key of it in this variable can be done like this. And similarly, given an array, getting back the first element into a variable, second element into a variable can be done like this. Is there another way of doing it? Yes. You can totally be like const a equal to arr of 0. This works as well. Const b equal to arr of 1. You can do this, or you can do const a comma b equal to arr. Both of them would put the same values in A and B. Depends on how you want to write the syntax. Commonly in React, the syntax is written like this: const count comma set count equal to react.useState of 0. What is this 0? The 0 is the initial state value, similar to how I said count is 0 here. And count and set count are two things that this function call returns you. Basically returns you an array. The first value of that array you put here. Second value of that array you put here. Now that you have these two variables or these two state variables, what have I done here? I said, कि भैया app this function. App this function defines these two state variables. Machine has lagged, guys. If you guys can still hear me, let me stop a few apps here. All right. As I said, what does the app function do? This is a weird function, Hakiyat. Starts with a capital A. Yes. But assuming this is a function, which it is, defines your initial state and says, I return a div which returns this button component or renders this button component. This that you see here is the same as this button component function that we had defined here. What was this button component function doing? Taking the count as an input and returning a button DOM element to you. And if you look here, this function is taking the something as an input, which are two things, count and set count. It's taking it as an input in a very weird way. This is not how you call functions, but here, let's say you are. This is how you're calling the button component or, rendering it on the screen. You're passing in two inputs, and this is returning to you button counter props.count/button. Heavy हो गया ना थोड़ा? मुझे भी लग रहा है heavy हो गया ये. Let's try to write this ourselves. Ignore this slide. Let's get into some coding and let's write some React code. Eventually we will come here. ठीक है? Do a few things with me. Number one, open your terminal. Once you've opened your terminal, create an empty folder wherever you want. Actually, don't create an empty folder. Go into whatever folder where you put your projects. I put my projects here. project/100xdev/code2. Run this command. npm create vite at the rate of latest. Give your project a name, whatever name you want. I'll call it a counter-app. Going to wait for 10 seconds here. What did I say? Number one, open a terminal. Number two, run npm create vite at the rate of latest. Number three, give it a name, whatever you want to call it. All right. Now select React here and select JavaScript. This should create a, a simple boilerplate React application for you in your counter app folder. Now open this counter app folder in Visual Studio Code. Going to wait for 10 more seconds. Then we will proceed. What I'm trying now is just writing the React app first and then understanding components and state eventually. 5 more seconds. Cool. Let's look at the file structure here. In the end, there is an index.html file here. What does it say? Standard simple empty index.html. It has a div here called root. Div id equal to root. Script source equal to /src /main.jsx. A few new things we see here. Number one, type module. Don't know what it is. Don't worry about it. Number two, source equal to /src /main.jsx. It's not main.js. It is main.jsx. What is JSX? JSX is just a JavaScript file inside which you can write both JS and XML. It stands for JavaScript XML. In the last class, I said it's a JS file where you can write HTML. Sort of this is technically wrong. Even though at many points you will see, okay, we are almost writing HTML here. You're actually not writing HTML, you're writing XML. It is just a file where if you look at this, the main.jsx file, it calls a function react dom.createRoot, says this document.getElement by id root dot render app. Ignore this, just remove this. What does this guy say? It says, okay, bhai, take this root element which we have defined here and inside render this application. This application is your first component. The app, what is React do? What did I keep saying again and again? Takes a state, takes components, and then spits out your final HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Here, if you look at the index.html file, it literally has two things. An empty div similar to the empty div that we had here initially. Div id equal to button parent. And then what does it have in the JavaScript file? It simply says render this specific component. And what did we do here? We called button component re-render, which would re-render the specific application, get the button component here. So this part is all that you have to write to take all the React code and shove it inside your index.html. We will see how that happens eventually. Let's look at the app code here. Let's remove everything. This is our first component. Let me remove this as well. Div/div. Hi there. Starting from the top, what do we have? Index.html file, which takes us to the main.jsx file, which calls .render on this app. And this is our first component that we have written, which I have just made it return hi there, remove everything else from here. Let's just worry about components first, not even worry about state. There is no state here. It is a static website for all practical purposes. Now, if I save this terminal, new terminal, run a command here, npm run dev. Before that, run npm install or npm I. Followed by npm run dev. And then it will tell you it's hosting your application here. And it says hi there, which is what I wrote here. It is styled very well, for which just remove all the CSS imports, go to all the CSS files and make them empty. And then you will have a simple hi there given this app.jsx component. There we go. This code eventually spits out this code. Harkirat, you said whenever you are writing React code, it gets converted into HTML, CSS, and JavaScript somehow. How is that happening? Great question. All the React code that we've written until now, which is basically this index.html file, this main.jsx file, and this app.jsx file. This is another way to write frontends. How does this get converted into HTML, CSS, and JavaScript? Go to terminal, close the last thing you were running, and run npm run build here. Don't run npm run dev, run npm run build. And you will see a dist folder is created, which has an index.html file, and it has a very long JavaScript file. This command takes your React code, converts it into index.html and a JS file and a CSS file, whatever. Now, if I remove everything, if I delete all of this, does not matter. This dist folder is enough. It has my index.html. It has my JavaScript file. This is what I can host on AWS, and then I have a fully functioning app. I don't need any of this to run. Just dist is enough. Inside the JS file, you look at it, it's a very big file because it has, if I search for hi there here, you see hi there somehow present in some JavaScript, very complicated. Along with this hi there, you see a bunch of other code. This is the React library and everything else. This code is similar to the JavaScript code that I've been asking you to write. I asked you to write this code. Okay, this is how React finally renders things under the hood. And this index.js file that it spit out effectively has these functions only, the re-render function, all that jazz. You don't need any of these like files anymore. This much is good enough. I can actually go to the dist folder, and if I open index.html in Google Chrome, I'll have to serve it. Let me just run serve. What this serve command is doing, don't worry about. But I see hi there. Now this hi there is not coming from any of these files. It's coming from just this index.html, which if you look at it, what does it do? Has a div root and has script source equal to /asset/ this thing, which is this JavaScript code right here. So effectively, okay, so a few things have happened. Let's recap and then let's dive more into the React code. The few things that have happened are, okay, we saw number one, how to create an empty React app, not empty exactly, boilerplate React app, which is very simple, doesn't do much. Number two, we saw it had an index.html, a main.jsx, which used an app.jsx, where we wrote some simple code that finally returned hi there. We took all of these, ran a command, and it spit out an index.html and some JavaScript file. This folder now has my complete app code. I no longer need any of this. This I can host on a website and I'm good to go. React converted the JSX syntax into this HTML code. Okay? That's a high level of what all we've done until now. Now let's try to create an application, the counter application, by defining a real state in our application, a real dynamic website. Until now, we have written a static website. Let's define a more dynamic website. Let's not use what is the first thing you have to do when you define a dynamic website? I said two things you have to do: state, components. I already have a component called app. I just have to define the state, and then maybe my life is good. So I'll define a global variable. Let state equal to count is 0. Okay. What have I done? I've defined a global variable here. Let state count is 0. Would urge you to do the same. Going to wait for 10 seconds. In the app.jsx file. So this is what your app.jsx file should look like now. All right. Now that I've defined the global state, Let me define rather than hi there, I need a button here which renders state.count. Now this is something new. Ki Harkirat, you are not writing state.count here. You are wrapping it inside these curly braces. And yes, whenever you want to write any JavaScript or render a JavaScript variable inside a React component, you have to put it inside curly braces, which is what I'm doing here. This syntax you will have to follow to render a dynamic application or a dynamic variable inside a component. Cool, save. Go back to counter app, run npm run dev. Now, if I look at this, I see a button, it says 0. Let me put the text counter in front. Counter space a dynamic variable which needs to be wrapped inside curly braces, state.count. Refresh, I see counter 0. Clicking on it does nothing right now. That is fine. Yahan tak have we reached? Should I proceed? Chalo, good to see. All right. Now what I have to do? I have to be by click karne pe state should update. Let's try that next. Now I said this in the last class. I'm going to say it again. Whenever you're writing code in JavaScript, sorry, in React, it's slightly different than writing code in HTML. Whenever, how did I write on clicks in HTML? On click equal to my function. This is the way to write it in HTML. But as I've said this a few times, this is actually not HTML. This is XML. What is JSX, JavaScript, and XML? This is actually not your standard div element. This is not your standard button element. You cannot write syntax like this here. The way to write on click is this. On click equal to function. You can also just put a function name here. For example, on click handler, and then define that function here up front. Function on click handler. Button on click equal to call this on click handler function. Notice I don't have to actually call it here. I just have to give it the function name, and then React under the hood knows कि हाँ भाई, clicking on this should call this function. Let me put an alert here. Refresh. If I click on it, I see the alert, which means ठीक है चलो, the on click is getting triggered correctly. What do I have to do here? I have to do a state.count equal to state.count plus 1. I just have to increase the state count. And as I said, React is looking at these changes. The purpose of React is give it a component, which we have, give it a state, just update the state, and then React takes care of re-rendering, which basically means increasing this counter by 1. React would automatically know that haan bhai, this thing has been increased, so I need to increase this to 1, right? I've been saying this again and again. So let's try that. Save, refresh, click on it, and nothing is happening. Does that mean state.count is not getting updated? Pretty sure it is. Let me log it. Let me click on this a few times. And if I open the console, you will notice state.count is getting logged and its value is increasing as time goes by. 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Then why is this not re-rendering? When I've said again and again, okay, bhai, the purpose of React is you give it state, you give it component, and anytime the state updates, the component should re-render. We have a component, we have a state. I am updating the state, but the component isn't re-rendering. Why? Because React does not look at every variable as a state variable. You cannot define anything on top and say, okay, bhai, this is my state variable. React says if you want to define a state variable, you have to do it a certain way so that I'm watching it. If I'm not watching it, I will not know that I have to change the DOM. If you want to define a state variable, Do it like this. I will give you something. I will give you this thing called use state. Use this specific what's called hook. Use this hook to define your state. And then if you update the state, I will actually re-render. But if you define your own global variables willy-nilly, I will not be looking at them. Does not matter if you're updating them. I will not update the actual DOM. Okay. So let's now try to use this use state thingy that React keeps talking about. Now I will define state a different way. I will say const count, comma set count equal to use state 0. Again, this line might feel a little overwhelming, but what is it doing? It is saying, bhai, whatever this function returns, this function actually returns two values, let's say 1, 2 in an array. The first value, put it in count. The second value, put it in set count. I can actually log count and set count, and you'll see it's like proper JavaScript functions. So if I refresh this now and look at the console, state is not defined. Oh, never mind. Let's look at the console. First thing, as you can see, something got logged. There are some exceptions which we will fix. But for the first thing, 0 got logged. So count is 0. And for the second thing, set count, also something got logged, which is dispatched set state. It is a function, does something, don't worry about it. The name itself has dispatch, which basically means, whenever you call this, it dispatches something which re-renders your DOM. Cool. But okay, we will get there. Now, what do I have to render here? There is no global state variable anymore. There is no global state variable now. We earlier had this. Now we don't. What do we have now? This count variable is what you will use in your state. You will be like, this is 0 initially. This is what I'll render here. And now the on-click handler, what does it need to do? It effectively needs to do something like this. Count equal to count plus 1. But this is not the right way to set state variables. I repeat, this is not the right way to set state variables if you're using the React state. The right way to set state variables is it gave you a function. You call that function with the new value. And now if you refresh, click on it, you will see it works as expected, which means in less than maybe 10 lines of code, we were able to write our counter application, which originally we had like 8 lines of code. When we wrote it the React way, we had like 20 lines of code. But if you actually write it in React, it's less than, here to here, which is 10 lines of code. This much code, what is it doing? Number one, defining the initial state. The same thing I did in that React simulation that we had created right here. Let state equal to empty state. This part is the same as this part, initializing the state. The returning dynamic HTML. कि हाँ भाई, given the count variable, this is how the button should render. This part you can think of it as this button component that we had defined, which takes the count as an input, returns a button element. Similarly, this is taking count as an input and returning the button. And then anytime on click handler is called, all you have to do is set the state, and under the hood, React re-renders similar to what is the equivalent of this in our code base? This function right here, on button pressed, where what did I do? State.count plus plus, and then I called button component re-render, which was the React part I was talking about. Yeah, this React will take care of. And now React is taking care of it. If I do call set count with a new value, React is automatically updating the DOM and this value is going up. So this much code base is pretty much enough to write a counter app. This much is actually enough to write any app. Most apps that you will see will have a very big state variable on top and a bunch of components defined at the bottom that use these states. And then as you update your state variables, your application keeps on getting re-rendered. Do we understand this part, how this code base leads to this sort of an output? I can again, run npm run build, and this will spit out an HTML, CSS, and JavaScript file. that HTML, CSS, and JavaScript file will have React. So it's not like I need React separately. Whatever is the dist folder that is created, I just can distribute it anywhere I want, and this dynamic app will work. I don't need any of these folders if I have this final dist folder. Whenever I convert this React code base into HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, which how can you do it? By running the command npm run build. Cool. Let's do a poll now and see how are we doing. Oh wow. टेल मी दिस, तो मैं पहले ही बता देता. इफ दिस इज इजी तो फिर अपने को तो पढ़ने की जरूरत नहीं थी बाकी चीजें. दिस सीम्स लाइक इट्स इजी. दिस सिंटेक्स वी अंडरस्टैंड, तो बढ़िया है. मतलब देखो यार, आई एम हैप्पी टू जस्ट डाइव डायरेक्टली इनटू द सिंटेक्स ऑफ दैट्स इजियर. द ओनली रीजन आई वांटेड टू इंट्रोड्यूस दिस ओरिजिनल बिट वाज कि हाउ वुड यू राइट अ लाइब्रेरी लाइक रिएक्ट ऑन योर ओन व्हिच यू डोंट हैव टू. तो सही है, दिस इज इजी तो ग्रेट. तो नाउ लेट्स डू समथिंग मोर स्लाइटली कॉम्प्लिकेटेड. कि रिएक्ट में, एज आई सेड, everything is a component. If I go back to the top bar, I said you can define multiple components. So let's define our own button component now, which will take count and set count, basically the state as an input. Let's try to destructure our application, make it slightly cleaner. So for that, let's define another function here. Call it custom button. And this guy needs to return a button counter space a state variable. This guy can take state variables as inputs. I repeat, you can pass to this custom button some inputs that you can then render here, props dot count, let's say. This is the better way of writing our application. यहाँ पे तो I shoved everything inside the main app component, but you can actually create multiple sub children components, and the parent component can just render the child components. So let's do that next. That's what I'm doing right now. I'm saying I've defined a custom button function or component. This is not a function. This is a function, but effectively it's a component, which takes again some state as an input and renders counter space whatever space props that it got as an input over here. So if it got, the input that it got was this thing, it will render counter 1. Input that it got was this thing, it will render counter 2, so on and so forth. And let's put the updation logic here as well. Okay, bhai, on click handler needs to be here. And it needs to call props.set count. So set count also it will receive as an input. It is not just getting the state as an input, it is also getting the state updater as an input, whatever updates the state as an input. ठीक है जी. Now, rather than writing all of this, on click counter logic here, I can simply write कि भाई render the button component, sorry, custom button component, give it two inputs, one the count, second set count, and render it like this. So this seems very similar to HTML, right? Where you have, button space, a few attributes. This is not HTML though. Again, as I've said, this is XML technically, but this will do the same thing now. But you've put all your custom logic here, all your button logic here. Button on click equal to on click handler. Try to write this on your side as well. Going to give you guys 30 seconds. Iske baad I'll introduce a little bit of another difficult syntax that is going to boggle your heads. And then if we have time, we'll try to create a to-do application where the state variable is actually, not a number but an array. Then we'll call it. Okay? So let's try this first. 15 more seconds. All right. Let me run this. And there is an error somewhere. console खोल के try करो, try to debug the error yourselves. Count is not defined. There you go. This will be props.count here because count is not a variable. It's part of this prop, or which is what are called properties. You can call it whatever you want. Yeah, you can call it state, you can call it whatever. I am calling it props, standard, name to put here. Refresh. Seems to be working as expected. Slightly cleaner code. Why is this cleaner, Hakiyat? Why is this better? Because now you can do something like this. You can reuse this component again and again. You can be like, okay, bhai, pehla needs to be count. Other guy needs to be count +1. Third guy needs to be count -1. Fourth guy needs to be count into 100. And then, let me create this. So in like some extra lines of code, I have 4 dynamic divs now. So that is why it's a good practice to, structure your app in various components. Can you shove everything inside the top app? Yes, you can. Should you? No. Ideally, even these state variables shouldn't be defined on top. You can actually move this state, in here, but let's not get there. High level, what we've done after the initial app is defined our own component and then rendered that component here. And the good thing about writing this is I can render it many times and I don't have to rewrite all the, button on click logic. I can simply be like, by custom button takes the state as an input and takes this as an output or another input, then does whatever it's supposed to do. Cool. Okay. Cool. Good question you might have at this point is, may or may not have. Okay, Harkirat, how is this syntax getting converted to, document.create elements eventually? Because that's eventually what is happening, right? Eventually, this code, all of this JSX file that you've written, is getting converted into some code that looks like this, which has a bunch of functions and has a bunch of document.create elements, document.create elements, document.append childs. You don't have to get into that too much, but at a high level, this syntax that you see here is actually not how React was written initially. Initially, React was written something like this. This would return the React.create element, div, or whatever, button, and so on and so forth. It would never return, HTML or what I've been saying again and again, XML. Originally, when React was written, it was written कि हाँ भाई, slightly easier way to do create elements, document dot append child, so on and so forth. In fact, if you go to the slides, you will see a comparison of the old JSX syntax and the new JSX syntax. So this is how we've written our app right now. And this gets what's called transpiled, which basically means as it is gets converted into this. Whereas you can see here I return button, but here what do I return? I return react.create element. I actually do a function call. Don't return HTML or XML. I actually return this. You can write React either way. You can write components either like this, or you can write components like this. Both would do the same thing. And whenever you are writing code like this, which is much easier to write as a developer, it actually gets transpiled into this syntax, which means gets converted into this syntax. And this is the original way to write it. And this is much more relatable, right? Yeah, by function is returning some other function call. Makes sense. It's returning some JavaScript variables. Versus here, it is returning a button only, which is very weird. But this is just a cleaner way to write the same thing. In the end, this gets converted into this. It's just syntactic sugar for what you see here on the left. In fact, there is a gist for it. If you try to run this gist, you will be able to actually, see it in action where this code actually also works the same as this code. Okay? Another high level extra thing to know. Cool, hai. That's a high level of all I wanted to discuss, if I'm being honest. Iske baad, we can take a few paths. We can practice more here. We can create a to-do app, which takes, an array of to-dos as an input rather than just a simple count variable. That will be slightly harder. We'll have to put, a for loop here, which is slightly difficult. Or we can pause and take questions here because I think we've chewed enough for today. So I'll do a poll. How was today's class? And then let's go from there based on the results. %15, 16% फास्ट। ठीक है जी। तो यार एक चीज और कर लेता हूँ थोड़ा सा, बिकॉज कल टुमारो वी मे और मे नॉट हैव अ क्लास बिकॉज ऑफ न्यू ईयर्स। मोस्ट प्रॉब्ली वी विल, बट विल बी अ स्लो एक्स्ट्रा discussion class and then I'll leave early. So let me do one more thing, and then we will do doubt session after it. Let's create a to-do application. We have created this many times now using the DOM way. Let's create it the React way. So what would be the state of a to-do application? Let's start there. Okay? The state of a to-do application would be something like this. To-dos, which will be an array. Title, to-do 1. Description, first to-do. And then maybe completed, false or true, and then so on and so forth. This would be the state of your application. Now, this is something new. Until now, the state of our application did not have arrays. It only looked, very simple, count 1, something like this. Now it looks something like this. In the real world, of course, you will have arrays. If you go to any website, if I go to LinkedIn here, of course, this is an array of posts, right? There's one post after another. So if you look at the state, it will be a very complicated array where every element has, title, description, body, comments, likes, things like these. Similarly, a to-do application will have this. How do you render, multiple things here, given you have, multiple to-dos? That is the question. So let's start by defining a simple to-do state. Const to-dos, set to-dos is an array which has the first element, title, go to gym, description, go to gym from 7 to 9, and then completed, false. Then maybe another one. Study DSA from 9 to 11, completed, true, let's say. Okay. This is our complicated state now, much more complicated than a single variable. How do I render this one after the other on a screen? Let's start with the dumbest way. Dumbest ways, bracket open, bracket close, just dump the whole object here. So take to-dos, dump it here. This will not work because this is an array. You will have to stringify it, basically convert it into a string. So basically, first dumbest thing I can do is this. Stringify all the to-dos, render them as such in a very ugly way. If I run this and refresh, at least I have state variable rendered here. Now, whoever, does not matter if wherever set to do gets called from, if set to do's gets called, new thing reaches here. I have a dynamic to do application. What is the problem? Problem is it looks very ugly. This is not how a real to do application would be. Real to do application will have like a title, description, a checkbox, so on and so forth. How do you create that? ये सब कुछ समझ आ गया? This part is clear. How to create a simple to-do application that does pretty much nothing. Just dumps the whole array on the screen, which is in itself is like hard to do considering we haven't yet worked with arrays. All right, we understand this. Now, number 2. Usually, whenever you're rendering arrays, you should create a component given a single to-do. So I'll create a function here, call it to-do, which will render a single to-do, which means what inputs will it take? It will take a title, a description, and a whatever completed variable as an input. Given these 3 inputs, it needs to render a div which can maybe do a h1 and render props.title, and do a h2 and render props.description. And then if it is completed, it will render done else it'll render not done. So we'll get there. Let's not worry about that just yet. Let's just worry about title and description for now. I have created a simple to-do component that renders the title and description of a to-do. Let me use it here. To-do title equal to Harkirat and description equal to Harkirat2. I can close it like this. Another way to close a component is like this. Both of the things do the same thing. Just put a slash here or actually close the component. Both will do the same things. All right. Refresh. It says Harkirat2. This is great because now I've created this. I can just, keep rendering it again and again. If I render it 4 times, I see it 4 times. If I render it 5 times, I see it 5 times. If I change, one of these to be Harkirat3 and save it, I see Harkirat3 here. If I change it to something bigger, I see the bigger thing here. Now the question is, how do I render both of these here? One way to do it is this Harkirat title. Now this is how you pass variables inside curly braces. To-dos of 0.title and then description. To-dos of 0.description. And then the same thing for to-dos of 1. Seems like I've almost done what we want to do. Given these two values, they are being rendered correctly. I have a simple to-do application. The problem is if I add a third value here, I'll have to, put a third thing here manually. That's not great. How can I iterate over this? Put some sort of a for loop that iterate over all of them and then, renders. If there are 2 values here, renders 2 to-dos. If there are 5 values here, renders 5 to-dos. For that, again, as I said, if you ever have to write any JavaScript here, put it inside curly braces. And now what you can do is to-dos.map. अब map जिन्होंने नहीं किया उनको नहीं समझ आएगा. Whoever have not done map might not understand this. There is a class we have already in week 2 or week 3 where we've discussed this. So go over it and then come back here. But I can do a to-dos.map, given a to-do, return whatever, to-do title equal to to-do.title, description equal to description, then close it. Now if I comment the first 2 out, this, call it a for loop, call it a map, call it iterating over all the values inside the to-dos array, lets you basically render a bunch of to-dos on screen. And now if I just add a third one here, all I have to do is update the state. And then, I see 3 here. If I add 5 here, I will see 5 here. If I add a button that, clicking on which adds a new to-do here to the state, that will also work. So if I do a button on click equal to add a random to-do / button. Again, this feels complicated. You can do a add to-do function and then define it here. What will this do? This can do set to-dos dot to-dos, and then now this syntax I will explain very soon. I have explained in the past a little bit. I explain again, but let me finish it. Title, new to-do, description, desk of new to-do. Refresh. If I click on this button, new to-dos keep getting added one below the other. How is it happening? I said by anytime this button is clicked, this function should get called. And here I'm doing set to-dos dot to-dos. What does this do? It spreads all the original values here. So if to-dos was initially, 1, 2, what would dot to-dos be? It will be the same thing, an array of 1, 2. But what would dot to-dos, 3 be? It will be this. So it spreads all the values from this array here. And then you can add more things at the end, which is what we want, right? We want all the original to-dos plus this new one to-do added to the end. And now as set to-dos gets called, I can add more elements to the state. Again, I only have to worry about the state. React takes care of, re-rendering iterating again over the new array and then putting more things, removing more things, all that jazz. Cool. All right, let's do a poll. Do you understand this part? Iske baad questions. Nothing more to discuss today. Is that clear? We have a lot of questions after this, so don't worry about it. I will do it out session, free only. Oh, this one's not clear. ठीक है कोई बात नहीं. Opening for questions after this. Let me paste this as a gist as well. For the people who don't understand, feel free to now call it. I think one code base that you can now understand purely based on the things that we have discussed until now, which is Mongoose as the backend and React as the front end. I'm unsure if they use React. 99% they do. This is a GSOC library, P5JS editor. I think this uses this exact stack that we've discussed until now. It's like Replit. You write some code on the left, it renders something on the right, and it is open source. So feel free to look at it if you'd like, and try to set it up. Processing this code base right here. I think for their backend, if you go to server, they use simply Express and Mongoose. Yeah, they use Mongoose. They use Express. So their backend is the same we've discussed until now. And then their front end may not be React. Might just be React actually. Yeah, seems like it's React though. There is routing vagara here which we haven't yet discussed, but at a high level, basically means whenever you go to /login page, this component gets rendered, so on and so forth. Look at it, else we'll discuss it eventually. But this is one of the first code bases that you can begin to explore with the current 5-week knowledge that you have, which is basically a Replit-like editor where you put some code on the left, and it renders something on the right. Now this code is very specific. You can't put random code here. This is like specific to this p5.js library. But yeah. This has like a bunch of other things. This has a Docker. Not necessary that you can understand this whole thing completely, but at least the stack we've discussed is the stack that these guys use until now. Cool, hai ji. Opening chat for any questions. And let me also post the gist for this first. I'm going to give you guys 20 seconds to copy it. Let me shorten it as well. There you go. That's the short link for the final gist. Feel free to take a screenshot here. I'm going to open chat in 10 seconds. All right. Sorry, guys, that happened too quickly. What was set to do's here? As I said, okay, you cannot define state like this. Let state equal to do's and then, whatever. Whenever you're defining state that React needs to watch, you need to define it this way. And yahan pe, whenever you're creating a new value, you cannot be like to-dos equal to ... to-dos, comma new array, a new element. React won't know that it needs to re-render. It needs to, re-put it won't know that to-dos has changed basically. It only knows that to-dos has changed if you update it like this, set to-dos, and then, send the new value in here, which will be ... to-dos, comma whatever. So whenever in React you want to update the state, you use this second thing that you get, this second function that you get to send in the new state so that it finally dispatches and then puts things on the DOM. You cannot do it like this. If you try to do it like this, it won't re-render. So anytime you're defining state, you'll get two things, the current state and then a way to update the state, which is what the set to do's or set count or set whatever will do. Can you please explain from the start briefly? I joined late. Yeah, class decliner at a high level. Today we discussed, if I want to do a complete recap, it is we discussed these 5-6 jargons at a high level. We did not discuss this. So let me remove this. So this is what we discussed. And maybe one more thing we discussed is, arrays in a state variable, JSX versus React.create element syntax, creating your own React-like library. High level, this is all that we've discussed. Whenever the state changes, it triggers a component re-render, but the component also re-renders if props of the component change. If yes, then how is React monitoring the props as it is monitoring the state variables only? Great question. Beautiful question. देखो यार, इसमें there are a few things. Number one, anytime a parent re-renders, its child re-renders as well. पहली चीज तो ये ध्यान रखना. So if there is a state variable, to do's for example, that is being used here, now it does not matter if I have, another component below, let's call it, dummy button. Dummy button takes no inputs, yet it will get re-rendered. How do you know something is re-rendered? When, if you put a log at the top, rendered dummy button. If you put a log at the top, if that thing gets logged, it basically means the component re-rendered. Let's see this dummy button, which is being used here, which takes no state variables as inputs. Literally nothing. Is a dummy button. Will this still re-render when the parent re-renders? The answer is yes. If I go to, this is a good question. It's like a bounty worthy question. $15 bounty to our friend Harshdeep here. Great question. ये मैं भूल ही गया था. If I refresh, if I click on, ASD here, ASD, oh no, not ASD, create a random to-do here, you see re-render dummy button got called. Why? ये तो कोई input ले नहीं रहा state. It does not take any state variable as input, does not take any props as input, yet it gets re-rendered. Why? Anytime a parent re-renders, all of its children will get re-rendered. Basically, it will just, irrespective of if a child uses that state variable, it will re-render it. There are ways to get around it. We will get to them eventually. There are hooks like react.memo that let you prevent this. But for now, if you don't use this react.memo thingy, then it will re-render everything. Number two, your second question was, okay, how does it monitor props? It's not really monitoring props. It's just that if these props are state variables, and if a state variable has changed, then of course, it will know to the props are coming from a parent, right? And if a state variable, if the props are a state variable, which means they were created using this, then the parent is going to re-render, then the child is going to re-render. It also knows ki, haan, chalo, if you're passing in a state variable here, and anytime that state variable is changing, it will change. But if you pass, a random thing here, if I pass, whatever, dummy button a equal to some random a variable, and then, a is not a state variable. It is something like this. Let a equal to 1. Does not matter if I keep doing a plus plus on, an interval. If I do a plus plus every 1 second, this will not re-render because the thing that I'm sending in isn't a state variable. It is, a normal variable. So it's not like React is monitoring props. It is monitoring state only. But if you pass in a state variable as a prop, of course it will re-render because, it is looking at the state variables. Where do you specify all the CSS like margin, border? Great question. So यार देखो दो तीन तरीके हैं इसके. The easiest way is this. You can do something like this. Style equal to border 10, padding 100, so on and so forth. So you can do this. As you can see, it became very big. That's one way of doing it. Then there are like Tailwind classes, general CSS classes. As you saw initially, there is app.css here. There are a few ways to put CSS, but if you want to ask, okay, how do I put raw CSS? The answer is this. Rather than doing, button style equal to border or whatever, padding 10px, you would do something like this. This is how you would do it in HTML, right? Button style equal to, inside double quotes, you'd put this. Here you do something like this. Button style equal to 2 curly braces. Question, why 2 curly braces are here? Because as I said, whenever you want to put any JavaScript variable here, you put it like this. Now, if you want to put in an object here, first you have to put curly braces for, okay, I want to put a JavaScript variable here. And then the object itself has its own curly braces, which is why there are 2 curly braces here. Is another difference between React and Vue? तो यार एंगुलर का तो मुझे नहीं पता, बट व्यू इज वेरी सिमिलर. व्यू ऑल्सो हैज दिस कॉन्सेप्ट ऑफ कंपोनेंट्स, कॉन्सेप्ट ऑफ स्टेट एंड री रेंडर बेस्ड ऑन कंपोनेंट्स. स्लाइटली डिफरेंट हाउ यू राइट कंपोनेंट्स देयर, बट व्यू इज ऑलमोस्ट एग्जैक्टली द सेम पैराडाइम. एंगुलर फ्रॉम व्हाट आई नो लिटिल बिट, इट इज ऑल्सो वेरी सिमिलर कि हाँ देयर इज अ नॉट अ स्टेट. देखो मुझे नहीं पता वैसे फ्रैंकली ऑन एंगुलर, आई एम अनश्योर एग्जैक्टली हाउ is the architecture exactly the same, but if I had to guess, yes, it has some state, some components, and then state re-renders components. Could be wrong on this, but React View exactly the same, almost very similar. Pace, while we do it on the sidelines with you, is fast. Please tell if code are writing inside and go ahead if possible. We'll keep that in mind. Code flow properly and slowly. Okay, code slow karo. Samajh makes sense. Get it. Let me leave the final to-dos code here so you guys can look at it. Component in React are like HTML elements made by us. Yeah, that's one way to look at it. That's technically 100% untrue. Okay, this is an HTML created element that you've created. But yes, if you think about it in a very theoretical sense, yes, it's like I've created my own HTML element. These are the attributes to my element, and I am rendering it a certain way. And now anyone can use my HTML element that I have created. So yes, technically it's untrue. This isn't you creating HTML elements, but yes, theoretically, to understand it better, you can totally think of this as you creating your own HTML elements. Component in okay, answer that. Can I make a video on components? Sure, go for it. Does it render component if I send request to LinkedIn, because it's already 99 plus and also possible accept my friend request? Does it render component if you so if your whatever function notification component takes the thing that it takes as an input, if that is a string which is either 99 plus or 99 98 or 97, then if this number keeps on going up, the input to this is 99 plus only, which is not changing, which is why it won't re-render. But if the input to this is the actual number, which is 100, 1000, 10,000, and then here there is logic, if props dot notification count is greater than 99, then render 99 plus, else render props dot notification count. By the way, this is the way to do if else. If you ever want to renders conditionally inside JSX, then of course it is re-rendering because the input is changing. But if the input itself is either 99 plus or 98 or 97, then does not matter what the final number is. Since the input is not changing, the component won't re-render. But if you write a logic like this here, then it will re-render. If you pass in 1,000, 10,000, 20,000, it will know that, of course, it still ends up putting the same thing, but the component will re-render. Giving away the setter function to children is okay in production grade apps. So yeah, generally you don't do any of this. Abhi ke liye it is fine. Production grade, unless you're using state management library or you're using something called the React context. Unless you're using React context or recoil or Redux or ZooStand, then how else will this guy update the parent? There are ways to doing it. You can create a callback function here which triggers the callback here. This does the set. But ideally, eventually we will use these. And when we use these, you will see you don't have to do this. Okay, you don't have to pass down components, sets and gets. It is done a different way. But for now, it's fine. Production app, maybe it is fine. Unless you're creating a very big app, you won't see any performance hits. Please explain use state. One more time, explain set to dos. Sure. So what did I say? Okay, any application has two parts, state and components. The way to create state in React is by using the use state hook. What is a hook? We will eventually see in probably the next class. But this use state variable. What does this do? This says that bhai, anytime you want to create something that React needs to watch. What do I mean when I say watch? It needs to make sure that if it has changed, it needs to re-render some things. Then you have to use the use state. Call it a hook, call it a function, whatever you want, which works like this. It takes an initial value as an input, which for to-dos could be an empty array or could be an array of one to-do, whatever you want to put the initial value. And it returns you two things. A variable which represents the current value of to-dos and a variable that lets you update to-dos. What do I mean when I say update to-dos? Ki bhai, rather than doing this to-dos equal to something new, you will do set to-dos, and to this function you will pass the new thing. This is the right way of doing, of updating the state in React. This is the wrong way. This might feel like हाँ ऐसे कर देते हैं. This is the final thing that is getting rendered. I will just update it like this. But if you update it like this, your components won't re-render. React is not watching this variable as such. React is listening to the set to do's calls, and anytime set to do's is called with a new input, it knows कि अच्छा चलो भाई components need to re-render. I will start the process of finding the new DOM elements and then put them there. How do you do this in code? In code, I say, okay, bhai, let me define this as an empty array initially. Okay, bhai, initially to-dos is empty. And anytime someone clicks on the add a random to-do function, this function gets called, which, what does it do? Adds a title and a description. To the original to-dos adds this. If this feels overwhelming, you can totally, write logic here. Let new to-dos equal to empty array, or let I equal to 0, I less than to-dos dot length, I plus plus, new to-dos dot push to-dos of I, and then to new to-dos also push this thing, and then call set to-dos with new to-dos. You can totally do this as well. Look at this code base. What does it do? It says, okay, I'll define a new in-memory variable, call it new to-dos. I will iterate over all the existing to-dos, put all these elements here in the new to-dos variable. And then I have this thing which looks exactly like the current to-dos, and push a new thing here and call set to-dos with this new thing, which has all the original to-dos as well, has the new to-do as well. Try to write this code base locally. It does the same thing. You can use the modern syntax that I showed you, the spreads operator, or this works as well. So feel free to look at this. This will almost work unless I have a bug here. This will most probably work as expected. This will update to-dos, and React will know that to-dos have been updated. Where are to-dos being used? Here, it will find the new set of things that it needs to put on the DOM anytime you click on this button. How do props work? So what are props? And you are defining all the state variables here at the top. What do I mean when I say at the top? I mean at the first component. But it's not necessary that, these state variables are being used here. This is the global state. This has, the things that will be used in everywhere. LinkedIn will have a very big global state. You might put it here for LinkedIn as well, for, any big application. But in the end, the child, sorry, I'll keep this here so people who are writing, but in the end, whatever child components you have, they might also need to use these state variables, right? So for that, you pass them in as what are called props. You can think of them as inputs to a function. Okay, by title of this to-do, description of this to-do, or if you want to, pass the full object to a new to-do renderer. Let's say you want to create a component that renders all the to-dos in a slightly more pretty fashion, makes them bold, makes them red in color, add some, new functionality on top. So you can literally do new to-dos. To-dos equal to to-dos. You can power to-dos state to new to-dos, which can render it a different way. Then you can, maybe define a new component, call it dark new to-dos, which define all the to-dos in a dark theme, so on and so forth. So these to-dos, even though they're defined at the top for you, might be needed in some random component, which is why you pass them down as props. Anytime set to-dos is called, which means to-dos are updated, they get propagated down to various components. All right. Can you explain props which are used, that are using state? Is it an argument or a state? Or state and arguments are the same? To-dos is a state variable. It is being passed as a prop to new to-dos, which is a component. New to-dos is a component. Dark new to-dos is a component. You can pass to-dos, which is a state variable, as a prop to new to-dos, similar to how you can pass an integer as an argument to a function. And then this function or this, component can use it whatever way it wants. It's similar to, if you have the new to-dos component and it takes props as an input and props dot to-dos is available here, similar to, const to-dos comma set to-dos equal to use state empty object. तो यहाँ define कर लो whatever happens when set to do's is called, it re-renders. Similarly, if you get it as an input here, then also if this global set to do's gets called, this component will re-render. It will know कि हाँ भाई to do's has updated. So let me re-render all the new to do's that this guy is supposed to render on the screen. And similarly, dark new to do's, let's say, takes to do's as an input and renders them in a dark theme. Let me just write that code really quick. Div and then to do's dot map this thing, and then here style equal to background black, color white. Look at the dark new to do's function. It takes to do's as an input, which is a state variable. So it takes them as a prop. And what does it do? It renders them. It renders them with the background color black and color white, basically sort of makes it a darker theme. Now, if I go to the browser and run this, click on add a random to do, you see first that they are getting rendered in the light theme, then they're getting rendered in the dark theme. How is that happening? Dark new to-dos is taking all the to-dos as an input, and inside here I'm running the iteration logic. By iterate over every to-do, wrap the component inside another div which has the black background and color white, and then render them one by one. So that is how you can pass any state variable as an input. And as you can see, as I'm clicking on this button, the state variable is changing. It is re-rendering both of them. These guys right here and this whole dark new to-dos component also, it is re-rendering. Code flow, simple code flow समझते हैं एक बार. React में तो there is not much code flow, but let me make this slightly simpler. Add to do looks good. Okay. Let's try to understand the code flow for this. There is a top level app. Here I've defined a state variable, empty array initially. Function definition doesn't do anything yet. We're not calling it yet, just defining it. Returns a div, a button, which actually calls this function, and then iterates over all the to-dos and renders them on the screen. If I save this, and what does this component do? Simply renders the title and the description inside an H1 and an H2 respectively. If I refresh this, I see an empty array. What happens? What was the control flow here? You can put console logs here and see. If I put a console.log here, app got called, add to do got called, to do component got called. If you really want to see, how are these are effectively functions. Someone is effective calling them, and it's the React library that's eventually calling them again and again. Let's see how the React library is calling them. How is the control flow actually happening? If I refresh this, app got called gets rendered. App got called, which means this app function somehow gets called once. If I click on add a random to do, you will see add to do got called, and then app gets called again, which basically means first the control reached here, set to do's got called, and then React realized that bhai to do's has changed. I need to re-render app, which is why app got called gets rendered again. And what else gets rendered? To do component got called, which is this thing right here, because now we have one to do on screen. If I add this, then two to do's gets called because the original one also re-renders, the new one also re-renders. And then similarly 3, 4, 5, 6. The more I add, the more number of times these get called. And every time I am clicking on this, app gets called. This is, if you really want to, look at how these functions, this looks like, you have defined HTML components and then you're using those HTML components, but actually you've just defined functions. And, as you're clicking in your app and you're updating the state, these functions are getting called by someone, by React, to figure out what is the new state. So, that is how things are actually happening. That is how the actual control is flowing through. But if you want to understand at a high level, what have you done? Defined your own HTML component, call it to do, which takes two inputs, title and description. And then you're just iterating over the state and rendering them one by one. If we create a file of .js type instead of .jsx, it still works fine. But how? How the React Mate just works. It knows कि हाँ भाई, it is JS. I think if I do this, the same thing it'll work. Let's see. I think this also depends on, we have used Vite here, which is able to understand and transpile कि अच्छा ये JavaScript नहीं, this is JSX. Somewhere in some config of Vite, I think this is configured. I'm happy to look into it after the class, but it does work. And it did not work for the longest time when you use a different bundler other than Vite. So I'm sure Vite is doing something under the hood to make sure कि हाँ चलो JS है, JSX है. We will ignore the syntax or the extension of the app, but I'm sure there's a good technical reason for it. ESLint gives me error in the code. Should I uninstall it? No, it's probably giving you a good error. Like it's probably giving you an error for a reason. What is the error? Look at it, and a lot of times, even if there is an error, the app just works. But if it is giving you an error, there's probably an error there. Please tell that npm run build and it serve all concepts to do's wala. Please tell the npm run build and it will serve all concepts to do's wala. Okay, npm run build, npm run dev. In the context of this application, do separate things. npm run dev, the name itself has dev, which means use it when you are developing it locally. Don't use it in production when you've deployed your application. When you're developing it locally, what do you need? You need that, if I make a change and save, it immediately shows up here, right? Which is called like hot reloading, or sometimes called hot module reloading, based on, how quickly it is getting put there. But high level, if I put something here, I want it to immediately come here without me having to, refresh the page. So for that reason, if you run npm run dev, that takes care of it. It starts a server on a specific port, and anytime you make a change, it's watching your files, and anytime you make a change, it puts those changes here. I messed something up here. Or seems like you cannot use .js here. It is giving me an error when I use .js. There you go. Okay. So now if I add some random thing here, it automatically appears here as well without me having to refresh also. That is what npm run dev does, because you as a developer need to move very fast. But npm run build will take your JSX files, main.jsx, index.html, spit out a new dist folder. Let me delete this folder. I have deleted the dist folder. I run it again. The dist folder gets created again. This is your final distribution, the thing that you can distribute to out in the world. If I go to the dist folder, it has an index.html file. It has a index.js file. This is your code. You can write this by hand if you want, like we were writing, for the longest time. ये जो बड़ा सा code हमने लिखा था. Any app can be written by you in simple HTML and CSS and JavaScript. In fact, here it's just HTML and JavaScript. But as you can see, it's complicated. A lot of code to create a dynamic website. Of course, you can write it much less number of lines, but it's easier to just delegate all of that to React. By you take care of all the heavy re-rendering. I will write dumb, simple code. Ye lo mera HTML component. This is how you render the HTML component, like that. All right. Inside set count plus plus, it's throwing an error. Set count plus one, it's not. So yeah, it is. It's throwing an error. I wouldn't have expected it to throw an error, but let's see. I mean, generally, you should never update when you are doing a, const count, set count equal to use state 1. Never update count. And you cannot even update count. Okay, that's why the error is coming. Count is a constant. You've said const something equal to this. You cannot do count plus plus. It'll throw an error because you cannot update a const. So that is why you're seeing the error. But generally, even if I put a let here, don't update state variables directly. It'll just mess up your, state reconciliation. Always call set count with something new. Count plus 1. Never do, count plus plus. This you're updating the original variable, which is something you shouldn't do. Last part was a little overwhelming. Supposed to be. I thought the initial part would have been overwhelming, but okay. Giving away the setter function to children is okay in production grade apps. I mean, for now it's great. As we reach state management, you'll see other things. React State is creating and rendering elements again and again. Yes, it is creating elements, it is updating elements, it is deleting elements, all of those things it is doing. How it is doing it, what it is creating. For example, ideally, if you look at it, for this to-do app, it should only be adding more elements. It should not be, deleting the whole thing and adding all of them one by one. So what it does depends on a few things. You actually might see a few exceptions here. Okay, key is missing, something like that. But at high level, React is the library that is taking care of putting elements here. So that's what you're seeing here. Of putting elements here, updating, removing from DOM, all that jazz. Why this component function needed props as arguments? Why can't we pass state variables directly? What do you mean pass them directly? Do you mean something like this? Why can I not do to do of something? Why can't I pass them as arguments? Why do I have to pass them as props? Is that your question or something else, Mayank? Can you ask again? Can you explain the Vite setup? Here, Vite is one of many ways to bootstrap a React app. Ab React kya hai? What is React? It is effectively a way to convert these JSX files into HTML, CSS, whatever. There are a few ways you can do this conversion. Vite is one such, call it a bundler. Bundler basically means converting this app.jsx into index.js. Boilerplate code, initial all the code that you see here. What is the definition of Vite? If you go to Vite, what does it let you do? फ्रंट एंड टूलिंग लिखा है यहाँ पे तो not seeing the thing that I was hoping for here, but high level, there is like many such frameworks that let you bootstrap your application. By bootstrap, I mean give you an initial code base, and then basically, they put in your package.json things like what happens when you write npm run build, what happens when you write npm run dev. And if you use Vite, you are using Vite as the bundler, the thing that's, hot reloading, taking care of, watching the files, things like these. So that's what sort of Vite lets you do. Are there other frameworks let you do the same thing? Yes. Can you do React using some other bundler? Yes, you can. I don't understand state function. How are they passed? Can you tell me step-by-step flow of state function and state variable? So how are they passed is a good question. Hakirat, abhi tak to we have seen functions and we have seen function calls. Never have we seen a function that starts with a capital number and then whatever inputs it takes, they are being passed like this. A equal to 1, B equal to 2. This is something new, right? This is something new, a new way to call a function, and also a function that starts with a capital letter. So, as I said, these functions return XML, not exactly HTML, but XML. But chalo, assume they return HTML only. Then, what are these functions letting you do? Someone gave a very nice analogy, which is pretty fair, assume it to be right. For now, it's not technically right, but it's a good analogy. Okay, you are creating your own HTML components, just like div is an HTML tag, span is an HTML tag. You just created the some HTML tag, and then whoever wants to use it, this is how they will pass in variables inside. Now, if they pass in variables like this, that's fine. That's what will get rendered. But if they pass in a state variable, A is a state variable that was created via this useState hook. Then anytime A is updated, the sum component will know it needs to re-render. It will know that bhaiya A has changed. I need to put something else here. Initially it was 1, now it is 2. That's a high level of how you write a component, how you call a component or render a component, and how you can pass state variables to it, which is what I've done here. Code flow in app.jsx. So I hope ek baar wo samjhaya maine through putting a bunch of logs, but at a high level, yes, it is just a bunch of function calls that React is doing. Each one of these things is effectively a function only, right? You can think of them as HTML components that you've created or whatever. But effectively, it is a function. It says function to do. It says function app. And just only thing is, rather than returning a number, it returns some XML. This function gets called by React again and again as the state variable updates. If you update set to do's, if you call set to do's, the React library has logic to call this app function, similar to When we we were writing our own variation of React. I was again and again calling button component re-render. Whenever state was getting updated, I was calling button component re-render, which was calling button component, which is this function right here. Just how I was calling button component again and again when I simulated my React library. Similarly, here, anytime set to-dos gets called, React will know, okay, bhaiya, to-dos has updated. Give me the new app. Give me the new structure of the app. What div does it have? What span does it have? And hence this function will get called, and hence you will see this log app got called. So you can just put a bunch of logs here and see when it gets called at a high level. Anytime state variable changes, app will re-render. And anytime app re-renders all its children, which is basically, all these to-dos will also re-render. I will put an assignment solution video for last week for people who are asking. How does props work? Okay, answer that. Slides link in chat. Slides ka link hai bhai ye short URL. This is a short URL. You can just copy it. Also happy to paste it. But if I paste it in chat, the chat will drop down, so I won't. For re-renderers, when using this common component in different parts of the application, since I can't use global state to manage props dynamically, how can I ensure effective rendering to avoiding unnecessary re-renders? Yeah, all of this will come when we reach state management or state management libraries. Then we'll understand how you avoid unnecessary re-renders, all that jazz. A bunch of errors, a very big code base. Okay, someone asked, seems like a good question. So let me copy this. Someone pasted this set count, set count. What does set count do? And what happens if we have to make multiple states, for example, LinkedIn bar? Oh, great question. So यार multiple states का answer तो ये है कि you can either do this कि const global state. This is the bad way to do it. Global state set global state equal to top bar notification count 0 and message count 1, so on and so forth. Or you can have multiple state variables. Const notification count set notification count equal to use state 0, and then another one. You can have multiple state variables. And your other question was, what does set count do? And as I said, whenever you want to update state, you shouldn't, there's no point doing it like this. You have to do it like this. So that is what set of any state variable does. It updates the state variable and it triggers a re-render. Versus here you will update it, but you won't trigger the re-render, which is why you won't see the state actually get updated in the DOM. That is why you need the set count thingy. Does set count is a type of callback function which will recreate state and type of callback? Yeah, you can. It's just a function. You don't necessarily have to call it. It's not necessarily a callback function. It's a function to which you pass the new state and it triggers a re-render, also updates the state. It updates this variable, also triggers a re-render. Basically means puts the new state on the DOM wherever it's being used. Why we define other functions inside app? Why not outside? You can. That is just to keep things easy. You can totally, have a new file here, call it button.jsx, and then, whatever component you want, you can put there and export it. Then import this variable here. Import to do from /button. So you can totally define it in a different file. What is the difference between Vite, create React app? As I said, there are various, call them bundlers, call them bootstrapping applications, ways to start your React journey and bundle your React code into HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Vite is the popular one, full controversy that happens. Doesn't matter. In the end, this is the code that one developer has to write once initially, unless you're writing, very specific app like a Chrome extension where it gets very heavy and, you actually have to update these bundlers. Most simple web applications, you don't even worry about them after running the initial app. But if you're writing, complex applications, by complex, I mean an application like a Chrome extension where, there are a few challenges that come, how to bundle SVGs, things like these. Those cases where you have to get into the depths of these libraries like Vite and bundle code yourself. Generally, you don't worry about it. Why have we added round braces inside the on-click handler function? Great question. कहाँ गया? तो यार ये जो ब्रेसेस है ना, these braces, it just react, or more specifically, XML syntax. You can't do this, and if you do this, it will think of this as a string. So for that, any JavaScript function call, variable render you have to you put it inside curly braces. Just syntax you have to choose. Someone wrote some nice definitions, so let me take a screenshot and put them so you guys can read. There we go. How to run React? Oh, npm. What do you mean run React? Giving away the setter to children. Okay, production is okay. Code flow publicly. Set count referenced by is props.setCount and setCount are referenced by, although directly jumping to React is easier, but don't stop explain how things work actually, just like you did today. What's the question again, Sahil? Is props.setCount and setCount referenced by? Are you asking setCount is getting passed in by reference or by value? I think it's by reference. SetCount is a function which most probably when you pass it to another variable it gets passed by reference. What is Babel and Polyfill? Happy to take a detailed class on Babel, Polyfill, Webpack, and dive deeper into it. Again, those are extra things not needed for the longest time, but if you feel it's needed, happy to take an extra class. Definitely no point spending class ka time in there. What if I want buttons to have separate counters? So you will have various state variables. You will have, so you can do one of two things here. This is a good question. You can either do, const button one counter set button one counter equal use state 0, and then button two counter, so on and so forth. But you might ask Akirat, okay, mujhe to, I can have infinite number of buttons. I don't want to define them again and again. So this is one way of doing it. Button counter equal to button one counter, and then set counter equal to set button one counter. And then this one can have button two counter. That's one way of doing it. What is the other way? Okay, you have these state variables inside of the component only. So since okay, the button ka jo count hai will only be used by the button. So you can just define it here. Count, comma, set count, and then here you can write all your logic. And then that way you can just do this. You don't really need these state variables to flow from the top, specifically if you know if this count is only being used by this button. Of course, if this button ka count is being used by this guy, this guy, this guy, all of them, then you have to define them here. But if they're self-contained, which might be the use case that you're looking for, okay, you have multiple button counters on your app, then you can do this. Define the state here only. And then, put these inside a for loop. Render them like this, whatever you want. How you single dot in set to dos, what happens? If you single dot in set to dos, what happens? How is set to do adding data to the array without using push? Oh. So let me control C here. So add to do में is this syntax slightly better? You might still ask here, how is set to dos updating the to dos without you pushing? And it isn't. It's not. If you give it a new to dos, it's not updating this by doing a push. It's just updating the value to the new thing that you passed in, and then of course doing the re-render. And the other syntax that I had was this to dos comma some new to do. So this syntax way, set to dos has nothing to do with this. I can totally define it like this. Let new to do equal to this, and then set to dos. Let me remove all of this. So the spread operator has nothing to do with set to dos. It's just a way to put all your existing elements plus one new element variable and call set to dos with that new variable. All right. Okay, answer this one. Styling हो गया. App is component we write. हाँ तो यार देखो तुमने लिखा है app का whatever is the logic inside app. Yes, you are writing. And where is this being used? In main.jsx. Right here. So yes, you are importing this and writing it. You can import it from a different file. This is just the bootstrap, top level that you get. You can replace it with whatever you want. Change the names here to whatever you want. Uh, does the state and component means every function should be defined inside the component, just like we defined on-click handler? The state and component means every function should be. तो यार हाँ ये जरूर है कि you cannot define state variables outside. You cannot be like this. Any state variable needs to be defined inside the component, and then whenever you're updating, let's say add to do, you can't have it globally here because this won't have access to your to dos variable or set to dos, right? So usually yes, most functions you will see are defined in this section right above when you finally return a div. New Year resolution 30-day or year 75 hard करता है. We'll see. How do add HTML structure and CSS React app component which will place. Okay, HTML CSS तो मैंने दिखा दिया. HTML is similar. I mean, put divs, spans, whatever you want here. All right. Can you provide React native course? तो यार बात चल रही है मेरी एक बंदे से. The only problem is he's not from India. So I don't know if you'll understand his syntax, and he's very, because he's not from India, is very expensive. So we will see. उसने पूछा है, he has done the standard thing of asked me how much I will pay him versus it's always nice if the other person comes with a number. We will see. More probably he'll be very expo. React Native तो खैर मैं खुद भी पढ़ा दूंगा, but he's really good. He's one of the early at Expo, which is very expensive. So we'll see यार. He's the original thing नहीं हम साथ में launch करते हैं. I will keep 70%, you keep 30%. अब देखो तो नहीं हो रहा. If you want to give it for a fixed cost to do it, so we'll see. Will we cover Redux? We will cover recoil. You will see we can cover Redux in an extra class if need be, but recoil. Most open source code you will see they use recoil. थोड़ा सा क्लास के बाद try to go over the video again, especially the to do part I understand, especially the for loop there. But yeah, okay, seems like question that I repeated there. All right, one more questions. बहुत सारे हैं. All right, curly brackets are only for expressions, not for logics inside components. As I'm running loop and it's not running. Oh, well, it might still be running. It might not be doing anything. So I can totally be like, oh, yeah, might be wrong there. Yeah, you're right. It is only for expressions, not for running actual code. Yeah, you're right. Yep, that is correct. Can please explain use of root and module in index.html? हाँ, तो यार, if you go to index.html, root का तो purpose is this, कि all you tell React कि bro, you will work inside this div. This is the div that you have access to. Any re-render logic, any put things in DOM, remove things from DOM, you do here. If I add any extra thing below, extra thing above, then these are outside React. React cannot change this. React cannot change this. React can only change this. Where have I said that this is what React can change? Inside main.jsx right here. कि भाई root is what you own. Render all your logic inside this root div. इसके ऊपर इसके नीचे anything above, anything below. You cannot change. So as you can see, ASD here, ASD here, had some comment that you also see. So all the React code, if I open inspect element, all the React code is inside this, or basically, the code that React is putting in the DOM is inside this. Thing above, thing below, you can, own. You can use Vue.js and React.js in the same app. You can be like, React, you have access to this. Vue, you have access to this, and use multiple front-end framework. If no one does that, but just giving you an idea. That's what root does. And what was the other thing? Module. So module है कि हाँ JavaScript. If you look at this, this is not a standard JavaScript file. This isn't, whatever where a equal to something or, const x equal to require. It's some other imports hai, and other things hai. So whenever you're using syntax like this, you use type equal to module. There can be multiple types of JavaScript files that you have. This is also like depends on the version of, ECMAScript that you're using. The original ones don't even understand type module, but since this specific file is a module, which basically means is using this import syntax, then you have to specify again, this is the type of JS file this is. This, I mean, you don't have to worry about this file and this file usually almost ever. Main.jsx and index.html you don't look at, but high level, that's what it does. Props, okay, answered that. Can I say we pass things into other components and receive things in that prop into other components similar to arguments to functions? Yes, that's the best analogy. Props to a component is equivalent to arguments to a function. Venkata, can you put your code and tag a TA? They'll help you out. भैया वो props वाला अभी भी नहीं समझ आ रहा. हाँ तो प्रॉब्लम देखो, ऐसे देखो. App, remove everything. No state. No state. Nothing. Let's say your app looks like this. To do. You said props नहीं समझ आ रहा, which I'm assuming means component समझ आ रहा है. You understand how I can render a component. Forget props. Let me clean this up as well. ठीक है. Assuming this, you understand. Now, let's say this needs to render something which is a state variable, which is defined here. How will this guy render count? I can render it here if I want. I can render it after it if I want. How will to do render count? If you can pass count to it as an argument or as a prop. Okay, bhai, I have given you count as a prop, and then whoever wants to use it, or specifically this guy, can use it like this. Okay, this has been passed as an input, similar to how you pass arguments to functions, and this guy is using it right here. I think it's high time to create a simple full stack application using everything you learned so far. It would be good for revision. Yeah, that was my plan for today as well. But tomorrow, 19% that is what we're doing. We'll understand use effect. That's the only new thing we'll understand tomorrow, and then create the to-do app ourselves. That will be the high-level goal for tomorrow's class. If we have a class, a single part of the function changes, the whole function runs. When I was here in my original app, when we wrote this complicated code base to simulate React, I was calling button component again and again, right? So the whole function was running top to bottom, right? Similarly, whole function runs top to bottom, whole function runs top to bottom. In our basic React app, we created a count to be a const variable wherein the value of count is changing. Why didn't we declare it as a let? Great question. ये चीज मैंने कई बार बताई है कि if there is an array, let a equal to 1, 2, 3. No, sorry, const a equal to 1, 2, 3. Can I update a of 0 to be 100? Yes or no? What do you think the answer is? I can. Even though, as you can see, the value got updated. Even though a is a constant, that means this array, wherever it is in memory, that place is constant. Does not mean you can change the value, cannot change the value inside these elements. Similarly, in an object as well. If you define an object, name Harkirat, I can totally be like obj of name equal to something new, and it'll let me do it, even though it's a, sorry, this is a let, but if a concept would do it. Why? Because it dot push 100. Const a equal to 1, 2, 3. Oh, I can do that as well, actually. Yes. A dot push 100. Yeah. I can even push more elements. I cannot do this a equal to 100. Then it will give me an error. Or I cannot do a equal to, a new array. I cannot do that. But I can push more elements, pull out more elements, change an element. And what is this guy right here? It returns an array, right? Count and set count. What did I say? This returns you an array with 2 elements. Some number and some function. So this number can always change as long as the array is not updating, which it isn't. Is todo equal to div, title equal to h1, description equal to h2? If so, that means the number of attributes an app needs to return should be equal to the component's main element attributes. Is todo equal to div, title equal to h1, description equal to h2? Okay. If so, then this means the number of attributes in the app return should be equal to the component's main elements attributes. Question नहीं समझ आया हर्षित. Does the set count function need to have set in the beginning? I renamed it to something gibberish and it still worked. You can name it whatever you want. The only constraint on names is that whenever you have defined hooks, they need to start with use. We will see eventually how we define hooks, but there is no constraint on what you rename. You can rename this whatever you want. It's just a function, you call that function. Name it whatever you want. Hanur iOS की बात नहीं हुई भाई अभी. First use Android effectively. Let him complete his iOS course, and then recordings we can maybe buy if people use Android. But let him first, exhaust his sale, do it independently, and then we can buy it. Iplix jQuery is still relevant? Doesn't make sense to learn jQuery. I don't know. I don't think it makes sense at all to learn jQuery. I don't know. Controversial. What not controversial thing. No one who uses it today. I don't think anyone uses it. Offline video slides, please. You mean 4.2 key? They're there. It's basically this. I think someone posted them on Discord, but here, let me show. Offline video key slides are here. And generally 4.3. You can always find them here. Just replace the title in this URL, and then most probably it will be there. Let me also paste. Maybe just let me shorten it. So for the 4.3 video, the slides are here. Right. Why are we using Vite instead of Next to create React app? Vite instead of Next? What do you mean Next? Next will let you create a Next app, right? Is useState asynchronous? useState is not asynchronous. Set count. This thing is probably asynchronous. This is not asynchronous. If this was asynchronous, it would return you a promise and you would have to await it. Since it does not return your promise, it's not asynchronous. Answer the basics of React, like component props, state, some hooks. Should I more React video to understand React on side projects? Just build projects. If you understand all of these things, build projects. Because you'll run into more challenges and understand things that way slightly better. React component takes props, use that. Props do something with them and return JSX. Then JSX is transpiled by Babel to React.create element, and then convert it, use its own logic to convert to HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and salute to Jordan Woke. When we hit set to dos function, it will restart the reconciliation, calculate the diff, and update the DOM effectively. That is a very nice explanation of whatever happens. Oh, recording ended, but that's fine. That is a nice explanation of what happens in the life cycle of React. Yellow G. You guys can read it. I have one. Okay. Does set count function need to have a set? No, it does not. Very basic question, only for logic answer that in JS code, where we use on button press when we are using set attribute. Oh, in the JavaScript code, we wrote set attribute on click on button press. Anytime the button is pressed on the UI is when this function gets called. That's what this guy does. Was that your question? Why does JavaScript choose to run app first instead of to do function? Oh, I told you that, right? That's what's mounted here in main.jsx. we say कि हाँ, app is the first thing that will render, and then app will recursively render the other things. All right, cool hai guys, 9:45, let's call it. Long day. Any more questions? You should definitely ping TAs. Tomorrow's class, if we have one, will be slightly chill, so I think you can ask questions there as well. Let's move to building projects now. I mean, not really. We should cover a little bit of React more, and then then we can say, okay, chalo, let's build projects. Tomorrow's class, if we have one, we'll try to create a to-do application end to end, write its front end, write its back end, and yeah, that'll pretty much it be it for tomorrow. With that, let's end it. Chalo, bye bye, bol do. I'll see you guys tomorrow, and advance my happy new year in case we don't meet the day after. All right. Thanks, guys. Bye bye.